All right, everybody. Appreciate you joining us. We have run a survey of the state of Illinois. I was just looking back. The last official survey was done by WGN almost a full year ago. So this is the first set of fresh data we've got in a significant period of time in Illinois. The headlines are not going to shock anybody when we go through this. We all know who the front runners are on both parties. But we wanted to get deeper than that in our questions. So as we go through this data, you're going to see that we got past that first level and got some pretty interesting information on who voters would choose in each party if the front runners, if Trump and Biden were not the candidates, who would people support? There's some pretty interesting data there on that. We also dove into the details of some of the presidential matchups, the one-on-one matchups, what next fall could look like. We'll talk about that. And we had some fun. We know Pritzker's not running for president, or at least he really, really wants everyone not to think that it's on his mind. But we did ask the question on if Illinoisans would support Trump running for president, because some states do support their leaders running for president. Some states do not. We've got some interesting data on how Illinoisans feel about the idea of Pritzker running at some point. We had that qualifier. I'll make sure to get you the question when we get to that point. First, I want to tell you what the data is on this survey, so you know who we called and who we tested and what the numbers were. So we'll bring that up on screen. We called all registered voters in the state of Illinois, and we used live calls, automated calls, and panels, I believe, were what's on screen there. We got over 800 responses. The margin of error was 3.44%. So pretty solid data subset that we have to work with for this poll. You're going to see in some of the following questions, we then did branching. So some of these questions we only asked of Republicans, some we only asked of Democrats. We'll make sure you know what that is as we go through it. Let's start with the headline on the Republican side, because I'm pretty sure you know exactly who's leading on the Democratic side. So we'll talk about the Republican side. And here, for better or for worse, it's also not a huge surprise what our numbers are. The Republican nominee for president, Trump's at 53% in the state of Illinois. DeSantis is at second. He's dropped. We've seen him in the upper teens in Illinois in some private polling over the last year. So the fact that he's down at 10 is a drop, so that is a significant change. Trump is also down a few points from some of the surveys we've seen. If you look at national surveys over the last week, he's lost about 3 to 4 points. That is within the margin of error. So if you don't want Trump to be the nominee, don't do a jig just yet. He's still massively in the lead. But it does look like those numbers might be softening a little bit. The challenge is, who is that secondary? Who's the challenger? Who's that next person? As you see in this survey, DeSantis has lost ground. Some of the other candidates, Haley, Christie, Pence, Ramaswamy, they've picked up some ground. And we'll talk about that in some of the next couple slides on who has actually picked up some ground here, because there is some upward movement, but we're still looking at a 43% gap between the front runner and the rest of the field. So as much as we're going to talk about the change in numbers, the headline is Trump's up by 43 points in the state of Illinois. So that's the headline, no matter how else we slice these numbers. But I do want to look at some of the demographic numbers. So let's pull up first the gender split on these numbers, because I think it shows an interesting thing. If you look at the gender split on the Republican presidential poll responses, you'll see there that Trump, as we see in pretty much every survey, actually does better with Republican female voters. You see there's an 8-point change there, where for most of these candidates, there isn't a significant change. Trump has always done better with Republican female voters. As a matter of fact, when you look at his last presidential run, it was Republican males who was the reason why Trump lost the general election, because a lot of Republican males didn't vote for Trump and a lot of independent males didn't vote for Trump. Republican females have stood by him, and you see that in this survey. Two other interesting things of note there. You see Christie's numbers, how he has 10% support amongst Republican males, and it drops to just 1 amongst Republican females. I thought that was pretty interesting. And Tim Scott is the flip side. He's got 7% support amongst Republican females, but only 2% amongst Republican males. The rest of these are pretty balanced. There's not a huge split between Republican and female. Those are the few that stood out to me. I didn't mention this yet, but feel free to jump in chat if there's something that stands out to you. We'd love for you guys to have a discussion. While I'm presenting the numbers, I'm jumping between 2 different spreadsheets and another file. So I can't jump on the chat too and see what your questions are. At the end, I will, and we'll have a discussion on some of the things you guys post. My political team is on there now. So if you've got questions, if you've got thoughts, jump in there. Feel free to share your thoughts. I'm just going to keep going along with the responses and the results, just because there's only so many screens I can handle at a time. The other split that I want to look at for this that we'll bring up on screen is the ideological split. So if you look at the ideology split between conservatives and moderates, you'll see Trump is dominating with conservatives at 61% support. No one else is even close. Now, conservatives make up the vast majority of the Republican primary electorate. But when you look at moderates, which do make up a portion of the electorate, you see Trump's support drop significantly. The problem is, for the rest of these candidates, it gets split between all these other candidates. Nobody is standing out as the choice. And so that's why you see that no one's really challenging Trump for first right now, where everyone's just fighting for second, because you'll see the vote here amongst moderates is almost perfectly evenly split between DeSantis, Haley, Christie, Pence. By the way, if there's any proof to you that voters don't know who the heck they're going to support just yet, is the fact that Pence gets more support from moderates than he does from conservatives. So the Republican primary electorate still hasn't figured their stuff out yet. The fact that Pence only gets 3% support from conservatives, but 12% from moderates, I just find kind of hilarious. Sometimes voters make me laugh, and that was one of them. Christie getting more support with moderates, Haley getting more support with moderates. That's not overly surprising. It was the Pence thing that kind of stood out to me. But we'll see how this race continues. So that's the main matchup numbers. Let's get into some of the stuff that may be actually more interesting, because it might break a little bit more news. I want to pull up, what we did was we tested if Trump was not running, who would you support? So we kept the list of candidates the same. We just removed Trump and let people know Trump's not an option. So now who would you support? We'll bring those up on screen. You'll see that DeSantis does lead that crew, but not by a huge margin. Ramaswamy has jumped all the way up to second with that group. So the people who are considering voting for someone other than Trump, you kind of see a bit of a trend there with DeSantis at number 1. 10 points behind him is Ramaswamy. Vivek's doing well for our boy Matt DeRay. I'm sure he's happy to see that. I'm happy to see you've got Haley making a jump here. Her and Pence are there at 10. Tim Scott at 9. So again, it's pretty spread out, but you are seeing some candidates stand out above the rest. You kind of have a top 5 here, and then Chris Christie, and then the rest aren't really making much of a dent in the numbers. Let's go into some of the demographics of those, because I think there's a couple interesting things that I saw there. So in the gender splits for that result, we're going to pull that up on screen here. What you see is that some of them are pretty consistent. DeSantis, Vivek, Pence, Haley, there's only a couple point swing. I thought the Tim Scott number there is pretty interesting, that amongst males in that subset, it's only 5%, but amongst females, it's all the way up to 13%. Thought that was interesting. And Chris Christie, dominating with males yet again, but not dominating, but doing much better amongst males than he is with females, 10% to 2%. Those were the two in that split that stood out to me. We bring up the age splits. There's some interesting things there. You'll see that DeSantis is doing better with middle-aged and older Republican voters, whereas same with Pence, he's doing better with older Republican voters, whereas Haley seems to do better the younger that voter is. You see her numbers kind of dropping, actually, from 13 to 11 to 5 when you go from under 44 to senior respondents. The rest are fairly balanced between the demographics. There isn't a huge change, but it does seem like there's a bit of a trend that Pence's supporters are in that 65 and plus demographic. DeSantis is middle-aged to older. Meanwhile, Haley is more younger. I'm in that under 44 bracket. It's not a surprise. Everyone knows I like Nikki Haley. So it's there you go. I'm represented in my own poll. Last split here I want to bring up is the ideology, looking at conservative versus moderate. You can see here that DeSantis does a lot better with conservatives. He's at 29% with conservatives, so much higher from the field. Whereas, as I talked about before, amongst moderates, it's pretty balanced. He's at 17, Ramaswamy's at 14, Pence, again, hilariously, is at 18, Christie's at 16. The only candidate that seems to have a pretty big drop from conservative to moderate, other than DeSantis, is Tim Scott. Tim Scott does well with 11% with conservatives, whereas he only gets about 3% with moderates. So I thought that was kind of interesting. All right, last thing on this is we tested just the front runners, just the, I'm sorry, hold on. I missed something here. We pulled out from the results. If you selected Trump in the first question, who did you change your response to in the second question? We felt like that might be an interesting nugget for people to have. So that's the next graphic I want to bring up is if you chose Trump in the first question and now you can't choose Trump, who do you change to? That was an interesting thing to pull out. So we're going to bring that up on screen. And what you see is that two candidates make a drop. Both Vivek and DeSantis actually drop from Trump supporters, meaning what I take from this is in the current race, those people who currently like Trump, if Trump doesn't end up being the candidate, you might see an interesting dynamic that those people who are most actively challenging him right now, Trump supporters say, no, you came after Trump, I'm going to go for somebody else. So if Trump's the nominee, you might see an interesting dynamic where his supporters don't go to a DeSantis, they don't go to a Ramaswamy, and instead they move to somebody else, which might mean that some of these second-tier candidates actually have a chance. It might be that if a DeSantis or a Vivek do indeed take Trump out, they might kill themselves and their political ambitions in the process. And because you're seeing that Pence, Haley, Scott, Christie, even Burgum gain more from this group than they did from the overall group of who selected somebody other than Trump. Pence went up with this group. He went up 5 points. Haley went up 4 points. Tim Scott went up 3. Christie went up 5. That's interesting. So Christie's the one who's been going after Trump the most, and yet Trump supporters are more likely to go to Chris Christie than some of these other options. That's interesting. So it is interesting to see kind of how some of the Trump, specifically the Trump supporters, where they go if Trump gets out. So I thought that was interesting to pull out. The last thing on the Republican side before we talk about the Democrat side is we just called out the specific top 2 candidates. So we asked, all right, if your only options were Trump and DeSantis, who would you back? Who would you support in that race? So we'll pull that number up. No surprise, it's not overly close. Trump's at 62, DeSantis is at only 25. That's a 36%. I know that math doesn't seem to make sense, but with rounding, that is indeed actually 36%, not 37. I can do math. But that's a 36% gap between the 2 candidates. So not particularly close at the moment from Trump to one other candidate. But what you're seeing here, I mean, unsure got 13%. A lot of people who chose someone other than Trump, because in the head-to-head, 47% chose somebody other than Trump or said they were unsure. The problem is right now, they're not ready to get behind one candidate. So when you say you have to pick between Trump and DeSantis, they're not all going to go to DeSantis. And in fact, we see 9% actually moved back to Trump in that situation, where if they have to choose just between the two. So a 36% gap. Chris will tell you, not very close. Trump is obviously still the front runner. I'm sure he's in chat saying that right now, actually, but I can't jump over to see it. Couple things we want to call out, just 2 on this before we run to the Democratic side. Number 1 is the matchup, the gender splits in that matchup. So when you look at just Trump versus DeSantis, and you look at the matchup, the gender splits, what I thought was interesting was, again, Trump does extremely well with female Republicans. DeSantis is pretty even between male and female. He's 24 and 26. There's not much of a change. But for Trump, he gets 57% support from males, but 66%, a 9% increase with females. So yet again, you're seeing Trump doing extremely well with Republican females. Thought that was worth calling out. Last thing we'll talk about on the Republican side is this. Just pulling up the ideological splits of those 2, the head-to-head matchup. So you see amongst conservatives, Trump is beating DeSantis 69-22. That's a 48% gap between the 2. Meanwhile, amongst moderates, DeSantis is actually beating Trump by 6%. So you do see some of these demographics that are, it's not a surprise, that are trying to find somebody other than Trump. But what our poll is telling us is they certainly have not coalesced around any individual candidate. Some candidates are starting to come up as DeSantis seems to be faltering a bit. Again, we got Nikki Haley in 3rd right now in Illinois. Selfishly, I don't mind seeing that. I'm kind of excited. Now she's 3rd at 6%, so it's hard to hold a party about that. But hey, I'm excited. Chris Christie coming in at 4th. You're seeing some interesting results. I'm not seeing a massive Vivek surge. We have a lot of debates on our Smoke-Filled Room podcast about, is the Vivek surge accurate? Because a lot of the polls that show Vivek surging and being in 2nd place in the race are online polls, and anybody who can tell you, not a lot of us trust online polling just yet. For reasons like this, you see things like this a lot. So I'll need to see a few more polls to trust that Vivek actually is having a huge surge. Maybe the debate hurt him, who knows? But I do know that right now it's looking like DeSantis is a little bit ahead of the pack, and then the rest of these, Haley, Christie, Pence, Scott, Ramaswamy, they're all grouped right behind DeSantis. All right, let's move over to the Democratic side. We asked voters who selected that they would vote in the Democratic primary. We asked them different questions to get their thoughts on the Democratic primary. First, the obvious one, who would you vote between Biden, Kennedy, and Williamson, which are the choices right now, the major choices at least for Democrats? It isn't a contest. Nobody's surprised. Biden's winning with 81% of the vote. Kennedy's only getting 6. That's a 75% gap. I'm pretty sure Biden's okay in that race. I think he's going to pull that off. It might get close. I'm being sarcastic. As a matter of fact, there's no point in me even bringing up demographics on that. The numbers are so wide, we just don't need to waste any more time on it. So that's the Democratic nominee question. But here's where it got interesting. We asked, if Biden wasn't the nominee, who would you vote for? Now, this is purely academic. We don't know who would run. We just picked a bunch of names that we've heard in the news. I'll give you those names now. We, of course, used Harris, Stacey Abrams, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, I never say her name right, Gavin Newsom, Bernie Sanders, J.B. Pritzker, Elizabeth Warren, or another candidate. So that's the options that we gave everybody. And what we saw some interesting numbers. Kamala Harris got 28%. Not necessarily surprising, though some of the Democrats I know basically say never Kamala Harris. So I was a little surprised to see her this high, to be honest. She has been in Illinois a few times lately. Maybe that's helped pump up her numbers a little bit. We'll see. Pritzker comes in at second in Illinois at 14%. Probably a decent number. I don't do a ton of Democratic polling, so it's hard to say if that's a solid showing or not a solid showing. In his home state, I would think I'd want more than 14%. But it is second, so behind the sitting vice president, that ain't bad. And then you see everyone's kind of grouped. Stacey Abrams is at 9, Buttigieg and Klobuchar at 7. Newsom, I thought, would probably do better. Didn't expect to see him at 5. Bernie Sanders was at 9. Elizabeth Warren only down at 4. Seems like her chance has kind of gone by the wayside. I guess I was most surprised. I thought Newsom might do a little better here in the poll, but again, I don't do too much Democratic politics. If you do, feel free to share your thoughts in the chat and what you see here, and if you think there's anything that I might have missed. A couple of the demographics to pull up, because I think it's important. We'll look at gender, age, and ideology. Let's start with gender in that race. A couple numbers you saw. Kamala Harris does really, really well with younger voters. So under 44, she's at 38%, but that drops to 19 and 24 with the older demographics. So I thought that was interesting to see. Same with Bernie Sanders. He does great with under 44 at 12%, but that drops all the way to 6% with Democratic seniors. So his numbers definitely drop with older demographics. Meanwhile, the rest of them are pretty balanced. Pritzker does a little bit better with older voters than he does with younger voters, but it's not a huge delta between those numbers. Really unsure is where the numbers grow. As they get older, it goes from 6 to 15 to 21% unsure. So as the older voters get, the more they just don't know who would they choose if it wasn't Biden. The next thing I would want to look at there is... Actually, I just did age and I screwed you up. Were you good though? You were able to fix it? All right, my production guy is a pro. All right, so we can go backwards in time now and do gender. Wow, well done, Lane. Lane Davis gets a raise after that because I screwed up. All right, let's go backwards and look at gender from our agenda here. You see Harris has a split. Actually, she's more popular with males than she is with females. 32% with males, only 25% with females. I thought that was interesting. Meanwhile, Stacey Abrams has a pretty big jump, 8-point jump going from male to female, only 5% with males. Meanwhile, she's 13% with females. Anybody who follows politics knows a big important part of the Democratic base is African-American females. When you look at, we don't have the graphic ready for this, but when you look at the African-American numbers, Abrams does extremely well amongst African-American Democratic voters. She's at 16%. So you can see why she has a big jump with females, with African-Americans. She's going to do very well with those demographics, and we see it here in the poll. Finally, looking over at the ideological splits, obviously, liberals make up a majority of the Democratic base, but they have a significant number of moderates, especially in Illinois. A big part of the Democratic base in Illinois actually represents as moderate, not as liberal. So I think this slide is actually pretty important. You look at Kamala Harris, does really well with liberals at 34%, but only at 19% with moderates. Stacey Abrams, again, sees a jump when it comes to moderates from 7 up to 12 with moderates. No surprise, Amy Klobuchar does pretty well with moderates. She jumps up from 5 to 9%. Pritzker, you see, is pretty balanced, 15 and 14. Doesn't change much, at least in this question, for Pritzker. All right, that's that question. Now, next question we asked, which I know some of our media members were texting us asking for these numbers specifically, were the Pritzker question. So add the caveat. This is just a fun exercise we did. We're not saying Pritzker's running for president, so nobody take this to mean more than what it is. But we thought it'd be an interesting question of Illinois voters. We asked specifically, at some point, would you support Pritzker running for president? So we didn't say this time around, we didn't say he's challenging anybody. We just said, hey, if at some point Pritzker decides to run for president, would you support that? We asked that question of Democrats and independents. We know Republicans aren't going to support it. So we didn't add that question to the Republican track on this poll. We asked it just of Democrats and independents. You can see those numbers up on screen. Amongst Democrats, it's a very, very popular idea. 72% of Democrats thought Pritzker should run for president at some point. Only 13% said no. That's a 58% net plus 58%. That's a big number. Pritzker's efforts to gain support with Democrats, especially the liberals in the Democratic base and the progressives, has done very well. And you can see it. We'll dive into some of the splits in a second of who supports Pritzker taking this move. On the flip side, independents do not support Pritzker running for president. You see only 15% said yes. Meanwhile, a whopping 60% said no. That's a big change. That's negative 44. I know it looks like 45, but that's all with rounding. The official number is negative 44. You can say negative 45. It's fine. That's what it looks like. But it's a net negative 44 on independents supporting Pritzker running for president. That's an interesting thing because in a general election, Pritzker's going to need more than just his progressive base. And we've talked about it a lot on our Smoke-Filled Room podcast, how Pritzker keeps running further and further to the left, which proves it would be a great choice in a primary. But when he gets to a general election, if Illinois independents are indicative of national independents, Pritzker might be in trouble in a general election. The next thing we want to pull up here is those ideological splits among independents. We thought that would be pretty interesting to look at. When you ask just independents, who would you do you support Pritzker running for president? What you can see is conservative independents, no surprise, 0% say yes, 91% say no. Okay, not a shock. When you look at liberal independents, 67% support the idea, 10% do not support the idea. Again, not a huge surprise. It's that moderate number. When we ask people who identify as moderate and independent, do you support this idea? Only 15% said yes. Meanwhile, 52% said no. That's a 36% difference. Again, I know it looks like 37. Forgive me. Math is hard. But that is a 36% difference when you account for rounding. And that's, again, not a good number. This is something we're going to be talking about on this week's Smoke-Filled Room on Friday for sure, because we've been saying this. As Pritzker runs further and further to the left to appease progressives, and maybe it's what he wants. Maybe he is that progressive. It's working well with the Democratic base, especially with progressives, but it's really starting to hurt him with moderates and independents. If he ever did decide to run for president, this is going to come back on him. And if he runs for re-election as Illinois governor, this is a number that I know on the Republican side, some of the candidates are going to be looking at, that in the middle, Pritzker struggles. And if he keeps going down this path, that number is only going to grow. All right, last thing. We looked at the matchup. We tested Biden versus Trump, and we tested Biden versus DeSantis. So these are some interesting numbers that we want to bring up. This is the last thing we'll talk about with the poll, and then I'll jump over to the chat and see if there's any questions I can answer, or if you guys want to share your thoughts on what you see in this poll that might be different than what I see. Last thing we want to look at, as I said, we tested Biden versus Trump and Biden versus DeSantis. So let's bring both of those up on screen at the same time. You'll see the numbers are similar, but there is a little bit of an improvement for DeSantis. So Biden beats Trump by about 20. Meanwhile, Biden beats DeSantis by about 18. With rounding, it's actually closer to 19, but we're going to say 18 because that's what it looks like on screen. But it really is actually 19. So there's a 1 to 2 point difference between those two. DeSantis does do better. I know other candidates are getting closer to DeSantis, so we could have tested others, but I paid for this poll out of my own pocket, so we had to limit questions at a certain point. So we just picked the number 2 candidate just to test it out. And what you see is that there is an improvement. We're not winning Illinois if you're a Republican and you're watching this. You're not going to win Illinois for president. It's not going to happen. But the fact that it is a 2-point improvement if it's someone other than Trump, I think that's notable. 2 points could make a difference in some of these suburban swing races. But the numbers get more stark if you drill down. So the final 3 slides we're going to look at, drill down into those numbers because there are 3 specific demographics that when you look at them, it's actually a much bigger difference between the 2 candidates depending on who we nominate. So the first one, and I'll actually do this in order so Lane doesn't have a heart attack. The first one we want to look at is the independent splits between the 2. So when you look at independent splits, let me pull that up on my screen, you see that Biden beats Trump amongst independents by 4, 38 to 34. But Biden loses to DeSantis by 1. It looks like 35-35, but with rounding, that's actually 1 point in favor of DeSantis. because those numbers are 35.3 to 34.7. So it's about a half point difference, which rounds to 1. So there is a 4 to 5 point swing there amongst independents if the Republicans nominate someone other than Trump, like DeSantis in this poll, versus Trump. 5 points with independents could make a pretty big difference in some of these tier 1 races for Republicans across the state. So that's notable. The second number we want to pull up on screen where you do see a big difference in the numbers is the moderate splits. So people who identify as moderates, you'll see amongst moderates in this state, which make up a big chunk of the voters in this state, Biden is blowing Trump out by 45 points, 66 to 21. Meanwhile, amongst moderates, Biden is beating DeSantis by still a significant margin, but now it's 62 to 22. That's a 40-point swing. So that's a 5-point difference between the two, where DeSantis actually does 5% better amongst moderates than Trump does in a general election. Again, that could have an impact in some of our tier 1 races. Last number, which this is an even bigger change, is when you look just amongst Hispanics. So the last one we're going to look at. So Biden beats Trump by 14 among Hispanics. That's 52 to 38 that Biden does better than Trump amongst Hispanics. Meanwhile, against DeSantis, Biden wins by only 7, 48 to 41. So you'll see there, instead of a 14-point difference, it's a 7-point difference. That's a 7-point change amongst Hispanics, which is a key voting demographic. If Republicans are going to win general elections, they've got to do better with Hispanics. And you see here that DeSantis does 7 points better amongst Hispanics and is only losing by 7 in a state like Illinois among Hispanics. I thought that was pretty notable to bring up. So you see, amongst independents, it's a 4 to 5 point change. Amongst moderates, it's a 5-point change. Amongst Hispanics, it's a 7-point change. That's a significant difference on how DeSantis does versus Biden, against Biden, versus how Trump does against Biden. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that someone other than Trump is the front runner to be the nomination. We saw those numbers. It ain't close right now. But the Republican primary in Illinois is not till March. 6 months in politics is an eternity. So there's a lot that can happen between now and then. Trump is the clear frontrunner on the Republican side. Biden is the undisputed nominee on the Democratic side, assuming that he does run. But there's some fun numbers. There's some interesting numbers as you look at some of the other candidates. Who else might pop up? You can see that liberals do support the idea of Pritzker running for president, but independents and moderates don't. And in a head-to-head matchup, someone other than Trump in the state like Illinois does actually do better in the head-to-head numbers. So those are the key takeaways that we saw. I'm going to jump back over to the chat and just see if there's anything here that I can answer. We won't drag this on, but I see some back and forth in the chat. Any questions you have, any comments, put it in that chat. I'll try to respond to it. If there's something we need to pull up in the data, if you've got a question about the data, we can do so. But let me just pop through here and see what I see in the chat. See Butler. As always, MAGA hat stays on. We love you, Michael. Figured I'd see that. I'm not really seeing. Where's the Vivek love from DeRay? Did I miss it? What do we got here? Oliver talking about how DeSantis has work to do. I mean, yeah, you do see, I'm seeing weakness by DeSantis, which is interesting because there's a lot of stories coming out and a lot of conservatives that I've talked to have said that DeSantis' strategy in the debate was a good one, that him kind of laying back and letting everyone else snipe at each other was a good strategy. My gut told me it wasn't, but I don't do presidential politics. I'm not at that level. So it's just one person's opinion. Some of the polling shows DeSantis still slipping. Some of it shows he might be stabilizing. It's hard to know right now where he's at. But I know in this poll in the state of Illinois, we saw DeSantis, I've seen him anywhere from 16 to 19 points in the state of Illinois. So the fact that we only see him at 10 here, that is serious slippage for DeSantis over the last, say, 3 to 4 months. We'll see where things go over the next couple months. But to me, I don't know that voters are going to be coalescing around DeSantis. And I do think it's pretty important to note that when you ask Trump supporters, if you can't support Trump, who would you go to? Yes, 20% said DeSantis, but all the rest were going somewhere else. And so I thought that was pretty notable to look at, that while Vivek is coming up and DeSantis is the number 2, a lot of the Trump supporters go somewhere else. So if Trump's not the nominee, if he's not the candidate, I don't know that it would be DeSantis. Kind of interesting. Let's see. All right, who else? Chris, what young person is voting for Nikki Haley? And then Chris is just looking to get himself fired. So Chris, I'm watching you, buddy. But thank you, Oliver, for standing up for my candidate. Michael Butler just doesn't like Pence. It's surprising from a Trump supporter that you don't like Mike Pence. I'm so surprised, Butler. What else we got? A Trump supporter in Butler saying DeSantis was overhyped. You're right that he hasn't met expectations. We've talked about a lot, especially in our smoke-filled room, that people in politics fall in love with the idea of a candidate. Let's talk about Chris Christie. Voters fell in love with the idea of Chris Christie way back in 2012. He was like the first YouTube sensation, was Chris Christie out of New Jersey. And we all wanted him to run for president. I had a buddy who was going to run that race. I probably would have gotten a gig on that race. I think he would have beaten Obama, to be honest, but that's just my opinion, and I know most of you will disagree, because people loved the idea of Chris Christie, but then they got to know the real Chris Christie and maybe don't love him as much. We see that with DeSantis. It was the idea of Ron DeSantis. Other than for Florida voters and 49 other states, you just heard this myth of who Ron DeSantis is. But now that he's out traveling the different states, meeting voters, he's not as personable as an individual, as a candidate, not as likable as a candidate. And so as a retail politician, as a candidate, not as good. Now, governing, you can't deny that some great things are happening in Florida. So as somebody who could be a great governing leader, I do think DeSantis could be good. But here's the challenge. You got to win first. And time after time in politics, we see the people who make the best candidates make the worst leaders, and the people who make the great leaders make awful candidates. And I think we're kind of starting to see this with DeSantis, that I don't deny he probably would do a great job in the White House, but as a candidate, so far, it's a struggle bus. All right, what else we got? There's the Vivek love from DeRay. All right, expected that at some point. RFK Jr. surge from Chris. Yes, exactly. Got up 1%. Interesting. You brought up black voters for Kamala. Let me try to pull that up. I do have the in-depth spreadsheet. That's way too much to bring up on screen. But let me see how Harris does. So for Harris's splits in the nominee without Biden, Harris gets 26% with white Democratic voters, 32% with Hispanic, 30% with African American, only 19% with Asian. So she does do a little better with black voters, not a ton though. The candidate who saw the biggest jump was Abrams. She went from 6 or 4 all the way up to 16. Now still second to Harris, but she is at 16. Meanwhile, Pritzker's at 14, and all the rest of the candidates drop off to single digits. So Harris did see a little bit of a growth amongst black voters in that question, but the one who showed the biggest growth was Abrams. All right, let's see. What do we got? Anyone else have any questions or thoughts? Just pulling through here. Give me a second. Looks like Butler's closing us out with a bunch of thoughts. Yeah, Suarez has dropped out. Hutchinson, you're right, is probably next. I mean, we'll see what happens now over the next couple months. People forget, if you look back at the 2016 election, which is the next closest election we can compare today to, Republican primary voters dated all these different candidates before settling on Trump. You're going to see this process play out where candidates are going to get a look. At some point, Haley's going to get a look. At some point, Christie's going to get a look. All these other candidates are going to get a look. They're probably going to have a 7 to 14 day surge in the polls. Voters are going to look at them. And for most of them, they're going to say, nah, I'm not interested. The question is who can surge and stay? That's going to be the big question, which is why some people think DeSantis' strategy of just kind of hanging on isn't a bad strategy. And I get that because voters kind of need to date these other options and then maybe settle on a DeSantis. So I understand that concept. I think you run the risk of voters actually ending up falling in love with one of these other options. There's a chance they could fall in love with a Tim Scott or a Nikki Haley. I don't know if any of the others have staying power. Maybe Chris Christie. Talk about jumping back in time. 12 years later, we all settle on Chris Christie. That'd be a weird world to live in. But there's options, and we'll see what happens over these next couple months. But it's only, it's not, let me make sure I'm getting the dates right. We're recording this on August 30th, so it's not even September yet. January is when things get really, really real. So we'll see what happens over the next couple months. I'm not seeing any final questions. I'm not seeing any final thoughts. DeRay, I appreciate the question about what does DeSantis need to do to win. I just got to tell you this right now. I'm humble enough to admit when it's above my pay grade. I don't know what DeSantis needs to do. I don't do presidential elections. That is way above my pay grade. I'm sure I could give you opinions, and maybe we'll talk about it on this week's Smoke-Filled Room. So make sure you subscribe to our channel, and we'll talk about it in depth on Friday, this poll and what it means. My political team will be joining me, and we'll share our thoughts back and forth. I don't know what DeSantis needs to do to win. Maybe you guys have some thoughts. We can talk about it this week because admittedly, that's above my pay grade. All I know is this. What DeSantis is doing isn't working. So beyond what he should do, find somebody who gets paid way more than I do, and I'm sure they could answer that question. All right, so I'm going to close this down. I appreciate you guys watching this video. We scheduled this knowing the debate was last week, and we wanted to follow the debate right up with our poll. So we were right in the field immediately after the debate. What we didn't identify is that this was right before Labor Day weekend. So a lot of people we talked to, there's a lot of news outlets that are shut down this week, a lot of political blogs that are just not doing anything or not doing much this week. Even a lot of our people were like, yeah, we'll watch the video after. We're not watching it live. We're shutting down pretty early this week. So most of you are going to see this after the fact. You'll watch the video, which is fine. But reach out to us if you have questions, if you have thoughts. For those who did watch us live, thank you so much. Please subscribe to our Long 9 Studio channel. We do videos like this where we release polls. We have a weekly smoke-filled room where we talk about politics and share an insider's view about politics. We have a number of other special features that we roll out. So please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll be excited to let you know what we got coming down the pipeline. We got some really fun things we're rolling out. But thanks for watching this video, and we will catch you in the future.